So I'm Scott Poynton, founder of the Forest Trust, which of course is now Earthworm Foundation. And I want to share with you some of the story of Peramperitani, the state-owned teak corporation in Indonesia that we worked with for many years to help them get FSC certified, but more importantly, to get guns out of the forest. When I first engaged with Peritani, it was like I was seeing an army unit. The forest rangers were dressed like a little military unit, and that was very striking. And of course they had their guns across their shoulders. And so the first thing you saw were the guns and the fatigues, and you thought, God, I'm in a military operation here. And you could imagine the community as these guys would come into their community. This is a very high conflict area on Java, huge teak plantations, very valuable, lots of interest from illegal loggers to come in and steal the teak. And sometimes that led to violence. So the rangers carried guns to protect themselves and sometimes to apprehend people who were involved in illegal logging. So when they lost their certificate, they called our team because they knew we were working on these issues in both natural forest and in the Kandari community teak plantations, and said, can you help us? We had said to the leadership of Peritani, we're not so interested in the FSC certificate, we're interested in getting guns out of the forest, and you will not get certified again unless you get the guns out of the forest. But before we could really take action on understanding how to help Peritani, we had to understand the context. When the Dutch were there as the colonial government, they saw great value in establishing teak plantations. The Dutch realised that teak grew beautifully in Indonesia, and so they went out there, and what they effectively did was to take community land and plant their teak plantations on what had been community farmland. So there was this embedded grievance in the communities saying, well, you know, that was my grandfather's land or my great-grandfather's land. And the Dutch colonial government had come, planted these teak trees, beautiful, massive teak trees that made a lot of money, led to the creation of a furniture industry, great for the Indonesian economy, but not great for those communities who had lost their land. And so when the Dutch left and Indonesia got independence, the communities were very hopeful that the new Indonesian government would give them back their land. But the Indonesian government said, well, no, there's a lot of valuable teak trees out there. What's done is done. We will create the state-owned teak corporation to manage those teak forests. So that embedded conflict remained, and it continued on. And so that there was illegal logging, there was efforts to stop it, there was violence towards rangers, there was violence in return back to the communities, and the whole thing just festered away. When FSC did certify 6 of the Peritani districts in the late 90s, I can't remember exactly when, there was an outcry from NGOs, particularly here in Europe, who said, how can this be? People are being killed, how can you certify that? Some years later, when in 2003, I believe, the certificates were revoked, 2002 perhaps, there was, okay, good, the NGOs were happy that this had been the case. So when we announced that we were working with Peritani to help them get the certificates back, there was great sort of despair amongst some of these NGOs saying, what are you doing, TFT? How can you work with murderers? And there was one NGO in particular who was very anti the FSC and quite correctly had been campaigning against Peritani's certificates as an example of where the FSC had got it wrong. He wrote to me and put about 400 other NGOs on copy and basically said, well, you're working with murderers, therefore you're a murderer. The NGOs had spent decades fighting against this, but still people were being shot and killed. But we'd been to the first district and we'd met the Peritani Rangers, and these were good people. They had families. They did not go out into the forest every day with the intention to kill. They were nervous to go to the forest themselves, but their job was to protect the teak. And we met the community members, who were also great people. And my view was that if we engaged and we made a condition, a precondition of our engagement being that the guns must be taken out of the forest, all of the other technical aspects of the FSC were relatively easy to deal with. Yields, all of these things, no problem. Teak plantations, when they're planted, they go through, they grow, the trees get bigger and bigger. The trees at about age 60 would be harvested. Big, massive trees worth a fortune sent to the furniture industry. Great economic driver for the furniture industry, lots of jobs, lots of revenue for the government, but nothing for the community. And during that growth process, Peratani would get in and they'd take, it's like thinning carrots. When you're growing carrots, you've got all of these carrots. You'd take out the weak ones to let more space for the big ones. And we'd call that thinning in forestry. So they would go in and thin the plantations. They would take out the weaker trees so that when they started, you might have 10,000 trees growing on every hectare. By the end, you might have 300. But because you'd created this space, they were all big trees. But as the trees grew and they got bigger, they could be sold. Every 5 years they would do a thinning and the wood would be sold and Peratani would make some money. And the communities are, you know, well, we're getting nothing here. We're excluded from our land, from my grandfather's, my great-grandfather's land. There's simmering conflict. And the communities would say, well, we would like to build a new mosque or we'd like to build a clinic. Well, we've got no money. And standing there are these trees that are worth a fortune. We could understand. And they were all good people. We're like, you people need to work together. You need to talk to each other. You need to find a way. And then Peratani said, well, we've got this, you know, sort of pulled it off the shelf and dusted it off. We've got this community benefit sharing program. I don't know, we drew it up a few years ago, but we've never put it in place. So our teams went through it and thought, well, this is terrific. And the idea was that if the communities protected the plantations, every 5 years, when there would be a thinning and a harvest, and they would sell the wood, the communities would get some money, a percentage of it. And it wasn't a small percentage. And as the trees got bigger and the value got bigger, it became a lot of money. And so we said, well, why don't you just implement that? And our team in Indonesia, a fantastic group of people, got the Peratani teams, got the communities together and sat together and spoke together as humans. The guns were put outside. The communities brought their grievances. Peratani explained what they were doing. And before you know it, this benefit sharing program was up and running as a pilot in 2 districts. And then it went to 6 districts. And then it just spread through the whole operation. So we'd started in 2003, working in 2 forests. And within months, the guns were gone. It was a fascinating experiment. And everyone was worried that the forest would all be cut down. Well, it didn't happen. Then we worked in another 4 forests and the guns were gone. And this was great, but they had 57 forests. And there were some areas where there was a lot of conflict with the communities. And here it happened finally in 2008 that someone was killed. So I picked up the phone to Ibu Upik. Ibu Upik was the Director General of Peratani, the state-owned Teak corporation. And I'm like, Ibu Upik, we can't work with you unless you get the guns out of all the forests. Great that we've got it out of the 6 that we're working in, but there's another 51 forests out there where your rangers are in conflict with the communities and with illegal loggers. And sometimes the illegal loggers were big operations, mafia operations. It didn't happen in one of the forests we were working in, all the guns were gone. But nonetheless, it happened in the Peratani estate. And Ibu Upik was also devastated by this. She didn't want this to happen, but it had happened. So, okay, what are we going to do about it? Well, they had all their process to talk to the community members' family, but what were we going to do to get the guns out of the forest so that that was the last death ever to happen in the Peratani forest? We could not go on. And she said to me, you know, the problem is, Scott, you know, the election's in June and leading up to it, the next 6 months is a pivotal time of high tension in the forest. We need those guns to protect our rangers because there's a lot of violence directed towards them, but to protect the forest. And I said, you know, Ibu Upik, let's look at this a different way. When there's a period of high tension in the forest, it's probably when we really don't want guns there because that's when accidents are going to happen. That's when conflict is going to happen. And you know, it's better that we lose many teak trees, then someone gets killed. And there was a long pause on the phone. And she thought about that and she said, "You're right." And I said, "Well, you know, we've got to get," this was just before Christmas, 2008. And I said, "You know, by January, all the guns have got to be locked away. We've got to get them out of the forest. Otherwise, we can't work with you." And she said, "Right." It was a very tense situation. But she talked to her team. It wasn't by the end of January, but by the end of January, we could see that the guns were coming out of the forest. And I think it was by about sometime in March that Ibu Upik was able to talk to our team in Indonesia and say, "It's done. 4,000 semi-automatic weapons from the hands of the Rangers locked away in arsenals before the election." And ever since that time, that last person in 2008, an absolute tragedy that they lost their life, but no one's been killed in a Peratani forest since then. So from this action of getting the guns out of the forest, I think huge benefits accrued to the people involved. Everyone benefited by having a great weight of conflict lifted off them. And that led to economic benefits, you know, social benefits, emotional, physical, mental and spiritual well-being that you cannot quantify. And that, for me, was a very moving story and a beautiful moment of courage from Ibu Upik when I confronted her on the phone and she went for it. And we need that courage to make these changes. So thanks very much to Ibu Upik. Thanks greatly to the communities, the Peratani people, and most of all to the TFT teams in Indonesia who did the tireless work out on the ground to make it possible.